There's a version of Satan you've been taught, without ever being told you were taught it. A rebel angel, cast out of heaven for pride, locked in a war against God since before the world began. Almost none of that appears in the oldest layer of the Bible. The original Satan wasn't God's enemy. He held a job description, and God was the one who signed off on his paycheck. Here's what I find striking about the actual Hebrew word. In the two Old Testament scenes where this figure gets any real airtime, the word used is never a name. It's Hashatan, Hasatan, the Satan, with a definite article attached the same way you'd say the accountant or the prosecutor. The underlying noun, Satan, simply means an opponent, someone who stands in your way. It gets used for humans constantly. David, at one low point in his career, gets called a Satan by the Philistines who don't trust him. In the historical books, the same word gets applied to Hadad the Edomite and Rezon of Damascus, two political rivals God raises up specifically to trouble King Solomon as punishment for his own failures. Political enemies, foreign kings, all of them, at one point or another, called Satans in the plainest, least supernatural sense the word carries. Three things stand out to me about how far this ordinary usage extends. In the book of Numbers, a prophet named Balaam is riding his donkey down a mountain road when an angel of the Lord deliberately blocks his path, described using this exact word, as a Satan. The donkey sees the angel and refuses to move. Balaam, furious, beats the animal 3 times before God finally lets him see what's standing there. This is not a demon. It is the Lord's own messenger, playing the role of an obstacle on the Lord's own instructions. In Hebrew, before this book was ever translated into English, Satan was a role, not a resume. So who is the Satan when the word does show up with that telling little article in front of it? The clearest answer comes from the book of Job. The scene opens not in hell, not on a battlefield, but in a royal court. God's heavenly council convenes. The text calls them sons of God, and Hasatan walks in among them like any other courtier reporting for duty. God asks him where he's been. He answers, roaming the earth, watching. Then God brings up Job by name, praising him as the most upright man alive. And Hasatan, doing exactly what a prosecutor's instincts tell him to do, pushes back on the premise. Of course Job is faithful, he says. You've protected everything he owns. Take it away and see what's left of his loyalty. Look at the pattern in how the scene actually plays out from there. God does not hand Hasatan free rein. He sets a limit. Job's body and family can be touched, but his life cannot. When the first round of suffering fails to break Job, Hasatan comes back, and God sets a new limit for a second round. Every single escalation in the story runs through God's office first. Hasatan proposes, God disposes. That is not the structure of a war between two rival powers. It is the structure of a supervisor signing off on a subordinate's request. Notice what's missing from this exchange. There is no rebellion here, no war in heaven, no fall from grace. God is the one who raises Job's name in the first place. God is the one who sets the terms of the test and the limits on how far it can go. Hasatan never acts without permission, never oversteps the boundary he's given, and never once opposes God directly. He does exactly what the job requires. He argues the other side of the case, the way a defense attorney argues on behalf of a client he may not personally believe in. The same figure shows up again in the book of Zechariah, in a courtroom scene that reads almost like a legal transcript. Joshua, the high priest, stands before the angel of the Lord. Hasatan stands at his right hand, specifically to accuse him. The text even uses the verb form of the same root word, satan, to describe what he's doing there. The Lord's response isn't to destroy him or banish him. It's simply to rebuke him and rule in Joshua's favor, the way a judge overrules an objection. Case closed, next matter on the docket. The way I read this, both scenes describe the same institution. A heavenly court with an appointed prosecutor whose job is to test loyalty and press accusations, always under the authority of a judge who outranks him completely. That's not a villain's origin story. That's a bureaucratic function with an inconvenient job description, filled by whoever happens to be standing in the role that day. There's exactly one moment in the entire Hebrew Bible where the word starts to slide towards something more like a proper name. In the book of Chronicles, a single verse says that Satan stood up against Israel and incited David to take a census. No article this time. No introduction, no courtroom, no cross-examination. Just a name, doing something, and moving on. Scholars who study this text closely have noticed that an earlier account of the exact same episode, in the book of Samuel, credits the same incitement to God's own anger, not to any outside figure at all. Something had shifted between the writing of one book and the writing of the other. A job title was starting to calcify into an identity. The question worth sitting with is why that shift happened at all in that particular book and not earlier. Chronicles was written centuries after Samuel, well into the period when the Judean community had lived under foreign empires and absorbed foreign ways of picturing cosmic conflict. Attributing an uncomfortable royal decision to God directly had gotten harder to sit with by then. Attributing it instead to a semi-independent figure named Satan solved a theological problem quietly, without anyone having to announce that the solution had been invented. What this tells us is that the devil most people picture, full biography, full rebellion, full war against heaven, simply is not sitting in the earliest layers of the text everyone assumes it came from. If you ask me, that gap is the whole story here. The Hebrew Bible gives you a prosecutor, occasionally a scapegoat, and right at the very end of its own timeline, the first hint of a name trying to become a character. Nothing about a fall, nothing about pride or a war in heaven, or an angel of light turned into an angel of darkness. That entire biography gets written centuries later by different hands for different reasons, layered onto a figure who started out working the day shift in God's own courtroom. You might think this is just a technicality of translation, the kind of detail that only matters to people who read Hebrew for a living. It isn't. Every religious and political system that survives long enough eventually needs its own version of Ha-Satan, an internal accuser, formally licensed to test loyalty and press uncomfortable questions, operating entirely within the boundaries the system itself sets. Inspectors general, whistleblower offices, internal affairs divisions. None of them are enemies of the institutions that create them. They're built by those institutions, on purpose, because every system that claims to be just needs someone whose job is to argue that it might not be, as long as that someone never actually gets to overrule the judge. According to Rivka Kluger, whose study of this figure remains one of the most detailed ever written on the subject, the Satan of Job and Zechariah is best understood not as a being at all, but as a function, a role two aspects of the same court could occupy, depending on what the moment required. Read that way, the earliest Satan isn't a rival power waiting in the wings. He's a mechanism the system built into itself, on purpose, to keep itself honest. Somewhere between the writing of Job and the writing of Chronicles, something in that arrangement started to come loose. What strikes me most is how quietly it happened. Nobody in the Hebrew Bible seems to flag it or explain it, or even seem to notice. A role built to serve the court began drifting towards something the court itself might one day have to answer to. It would take a very different kind of literature, written in a very different century, to turn a job description into a rebellion, and to give the accuser, for the first time, a story of his own. Among the scrolls, sealed inside a cave at Qumran for nearly 2,000 years, is something that reads, at first glance, like a military field manual. 19 columns of Hebrew script written on leather, describing battle formations, troop counts, and the precise age at which a man could serve in the front line. Discovered in 1947, alongside the very first Dead Sea Scrolls to surface, It describes, column by column, a 40-year war and names the enemy commander leading the other side. Not a king, not an empire, a figure called Belial, the angel of enmity, made by God himself, the text says, for the pit. By the time this scroll was written, something had changed since the courtroom scenes we traced earlier. The Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures produced for Jews living outside Judea, rendered ha-Satan using a new Greek word, diabolos, the slanderer, the same word that eventually became the English devil. That single translation choice did something the original Hebrew text never quite managed. It gave the accuser a portable name that worked outside Hebrew grammar entirely, one that didn't need a definite article to signal it was talking about a specific figure rather than just any old adversary. And in the centuries surrounding that translation, Jewish writers under first Persian, then Greek, then Roman rule began producing an enormous body of literature that never made it into most Bibles at all. In that literature, the quiet prosecutor from Job multiplies into an entire cast of increasingly personal, increasingly dangerous names. Here's what I find striking about how many of them there are. The community that produced the War Scroll organized its entire worldview around a document called the Community Rule. And within it, a passage scholars now call the Treatise on the Two Spirits. God, it says, appointed two spirits to govern creation from the beginning, a prince of light and an angel of darkness. Every person born into the world falls under the influence of one or the other, walking either in the ways of light or in the ways of darkness, according to which lot they were assigned before they ever drew breath. The second of these ruling spirits is Belial, commander of the sons of darkness, leading them into error and corruption until the appointed day of reckoning. This is not a subordinate testing loyalty with permission slips anymore. Belial has an army, a jurisdiction, and an entire war named after him. Notice what's missing from that same community's other writings, though: consistency. In a related text known as the Damascus document, Belial is described doing something oddly specific, inspiring two Egyptian sorcerers to stand against Moses and Aaron in Pharaoh's court. Anyone who has spent time with the Book of Jubilees will recognize that exact scene. In Jubilees, it isn't Belial standing behind Pharaoh's magicians. It's a different figure entirely, one named Mastema, doing the identical job. Same court, same magic trick, same narrative slot, written, as far as anyone can tell, without either community coordinating with the other. The way I read this, nobody in the Second Temple period had settled on a single devil yet. What they had instead was a job opening: cosmic tempter, cosmic accuser, ruler of the forces opposing God, and multiple competing texts kept nominating different names to fill it. According to the Book of Enoch, a text preserved in full only in Ethiopic, but confirmed in Aramaic fragments recovered from these same Qumran caves, the position goes to a figure called Samyaza, leader of 200 rebellious watchers who abandon their posts in heaven, descend to earth, marry human women, and teach humanity secrets it was never meant to have. Their leader gives his name to the whole rebellion. The text lists his followers by name, one after another, an entire roster of angels choosing exile over obedience. In the Qumran War Scroll, the position goes to Belial instead. In the Book of Jubilees, it goes to a third figure entirely, Mastema. None of these communities seem to have been reading each other's work as a unified mythology. They were each solving the same theological problem independently and arriving again and again at strikingly similar answers. This wasn't the first time a religious tradition needed more than one candidate before a single villain finally won out. Look at the pattern across other traditions from roughly the same window of history, and you'll find the same scattering, multiple names competing to explain the same absence before politics, popularity, or simple repetition let one of them consolidate the rest under a single title. Rome absorbed a dozen local underworld gods before Pluto's name outlasted the others. Zoroastrianism itself, by contrast, had already resolved this exact question centuries earlier, naming a single evil spirit almost from the start. Some scholars trace part of this Jewish scattering to something outside Judaism altogether. What strikes me most is the timing more than the resemblance. For much of the Second Temple period, Jewish communities lived under the Persian Achaemenid Empire, whose official religion was Zoroastrianism, a faith built, more explicitly than almost any other in the ancient world, around a single evil force locked in permanent cosmic opposition to a single good one, a spirit the Persians called Angra Mainyu. Some historians argue this proximity left a mark, that the sudden Jewish appetite for a more organized, more oppositional evil figure reflects contact with Persian dualism during the centuries of imperial rule. Not every researcher agrees on how far that influence actually reached, and the case rests more on timing and resemblance than on any document that states the borrowing directly. What's harder to dispute is the timing itself. This entire cast of named adversaries appears only after the Persian period begins, not before it. What this tells us is that the devil most people picture today wasn't assembled all at once by one author in one book. He was built out of spare parts, scavenged from half a dozen competing texts that never even agreed on his name, in a period when Judaism itself was absorbing new imperial neighbors, new languages, and new ways of picturing the shape of a cosmic argument. Belial, ruling his sons of darkness, tied in one Qumran text to 3 nets set to snare humanity: fornication, wealth, and the pollution of the sanctuary. Mastema, bargaining for his 10th of the drowned spirits. Samyaza, leading 200 watchers down from heaven, his name recorded first among them like a ringleader booked into evidence. 3 names, 1 vacancy, and no consensus yet on who should fill it permanently. You might think a detail like this belongs only in a footnote for specialists. It doesn't. Every tradition that eventually settles on a single antagonist goes through exactly this kind of messy audition process first, usually erased from the version people are taught afterward. By the time a story reaches its final, tidy form, someone has already done the work of picking a winner and quietly retiring the runners-up. The Book of Enoch's Samyaza and the Qumran War Scrolls Belial did not lose to obscurity because they were poorly written. They lost because history eventually needed only one name standing at the end of this contest, and neither of theirs was the one destiny, or more precisely, later Christian editors would choose. 3 things stand out to me about what all these candidates actually share underneath their different names. Each one is granted power, not born with it. Each one operates with a specific jurisdiction rather than unlimited reach. And each one is still, even at his most menacing, answerable to a court he did not create and cannot overrule. That structure hadn't changed since Job. What had changed was the size of the stage these figures were now allowed to occupy on it. That choice hadn't been made yet, not in this literature. What these overlapping, half-competing texts left behind instead was a loose, unfinished cast of candidates, each one dangerous, each one only partly formed, waiting for a single author somewhere down the line to pick one thread out of this tangle and follow it all the way to its fall from heaven. In a cave beneath a church in Bethlehem, sometime in the final years of the 4th century, a scholar named Jerome sat working through the Hebrew text of Isaiah by lamplight, translating it word by word into Latin for what would become the Vulgate, the Bible most of the Western world would read for the next 1,000 years. He reached chapter 14, verse 12, and a phrase describing a fallen king, Helel ben Shachar, Shining One, Son of the Dawn, an old poetic name for the morning star, the planet we call Venus. Jerome needed a Latin word that carried the same light-bearing sense. He chose Lucifer, light-bringer, a perfectly ordinary Latin word already used elsewhere for the planet itself. It was a reasonable translation of a single adjective. It also became, almost by accident, the proper name that would define the West's image of the devil for the next 1600 years. To understand what Jerome actually translated, you have to go back to what Isaiah originally wrote it about. The passage is a taunt song, the kind of mocking victory poem ancient scribes composed to gloat over a defeated enemy. Its target is named directly 2 chapters earlier, the king of Babylon. The poem pictures this king boasting that he will climb above the stars and sit enthroned like a god, set his throne even higher than the mountain of the gods themselves, only to be dragged down to the underworld like every other mortal who overreached, maggots for a bed and worms for a blanket. "How you have fallen from heaven, shining one, son of the dawn," the poem jeers, aimed squarely at a human tyrant, written centuries before anyone connected it to angels at all. Ancient audiences hearing this poem performed aloud would have understood immediately who it mocked. Nothing about angels, nothing about a war before creation, just a king who reached too high and a poet enjoying the irony of his fall. Here's what I find striking about how long that original meaning survived, compared to how quickly it disappeared. For close to 1,000 years, this verse sat inside a book of political poetry about the collapse of a specific Mesopotamian empire. Then, starting in the 2nd century, Christian writers, including Justin Martyr, Tertullian, and later Origen, began reading it differently. They noticed a line from the Gospel of Luke, where Jesus tells his disciples, "I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven," and a scene in the book of Revelation, describing a war in heaven in which a great dragon, that ancient serpent called the devil and Satan, is defeated and hurled down to earth. Isaiah's taunt against a dead Babylonian king got folded into these 2 much later Christian texts, and a single continuous story began to take shape for the first time. Pride, rebellion, a war in the heavens, and a fall. Notice what's missing from every one of the older names this series has already traced. Belial never fell from anywhere. He was appointed, ruling his portion of darkness by God's own design. Mastema was granted his role after asking for it, not stripped of one he already held. Samyaza abandoned his post willingly, leading 200 followers down to earth rather than being cast out against his will. None of the Second Temple candidates carry this specific arc. Pride followed by expulsion, a rebellion against a rightful throne. That plot device belongs to a Babylonian king in a 7th century before Christ poem, grafted centuries later onto an entirely different figure who had never previously needed an origin story at all. The way I read this, something important happens in this period, beyond just borrowing a verse. All those competing Second Temple names, Belial with his army, Mastema with his bargain, Samyaza with his rebellion, start collapsing into a single figure carrying a single biography. According to the surviving count of every appearance in the New Testament, the word Satan shows up only 36 times across the entire collection, mostly without ceremony. A tempter meeting Jesus in the wilderness after 40 days without food, offering him bread from stones and the kingdoms of the world in exchange for worship. The ruler of this world, in the Gospel of John, a phrase used almost in passing. A roaring lion looking for someone to devour, in the first letter attributed to Peter. A figure Paul blames for a physical ailment he calls a thorn in the flesh. None of these passages describe a fall from grace directly, and none of them bother to explain where this figure came from in the first place. He simply appears, already active, already opposed to God, as though the audience is expected to already know his backstory. It is the Church Fathers, reading Isaiah's taunt song backward through Luke and Revelation, who supply the missing Act 1 that the New Testament itself never bothered to write. This wasn't the first time a religious tradition needed an origin story more than it needed accuracy about where that story actually came from. Once you have Isaiah's falling king, Luke's lightning, and Revelation's dragon read as 3 chapters of the same event, you have something none of the earlier texts ever offered: a complete character arc with a beginning, a motive, and a fixed identity. Belial, Mastema, and Samyaza had all been rivals for a job opening. Lucifer, once assembled this way, wasn't applying for the position. He already held it, permanently, with a biography stretching back before the world began. Look at the pattern in how deliberately this assembly happened. Origen, writing in the 3rd century, explicitly connects Isaiah's fallen king to the figure of Satan in his major theological work, treating the identification as though it required no defense at all. Tertullian does the same a generation earlier, and Justin Martyr earlier still. What strikes me most is how none of the 3 seem to feel the need to argue for the connection at all. They write as though the link between a Babylonian king and a fallen angel was already common knowledge, rather than something their own generation had only recently decided. By the time later councils and creeds took shape, the merger wasn't treated as an interpretation anyone needed to argue for. It had simply become the story, repeated often enough by writers respected enough that its assembled origins stopped being visible at all. None of this is an argument against the New Testament or against Christian faith. Scholars who study these texts, including many who hold the faith themselves, generally agree that Isaiah's own words were written about a human king, and that the fall of Lucifer narrative most Christians know today was assembled afterward, out of separate texts written centuries apart, by writers solving a real theological problem with the material available to them. Faith asks what these stories mean for how a person should live. History asks how the pieces actually got put together, and in what order. Both questions can be asked at once, by the same person, without either one canceling out the other. What this tells us is that Lucifer was never a name in the Hebrew Bible at all. It was an adjective, describing a planet, repurposed to translate a phrase mocking a dead king, in a language that king never spoke, for an audience reading it 1,000 years after the fact. Jerome's word choice in that Bethlehem cave was not a mistranslation exactly. Lucifer is a fair Latin rendering of shining one. It became something else only because later readers had already decided, before they opened Isaiah, exactly whose fall they were looking for. The dragon in Revelation still had a face nobody had bothered to draw. 3 things stand out to me about what he still lacked at this point in the story. He had a name now, and a story, and a permanent address at the bottom of a fall from grace. What he did not yet have was the shape everyone alive today would recognize on sight: the horns, the hooves, the tail curling behind him like an afterthought. That image belonged to a different century, and to gods this story hadn't borrowed from yet. A monk in a scriptorium somewhere in 9th century Europe dips his brush and paints a small figure into the margin of a manuscript page. He gives it a human torso, a scholar's usual choice for anything meant to look intelligent and dangerous at once. But for the legs, he reaches for something else entirely: cloven hooves, the hindquarters of a goat, a detail borrowed wholesale from a much older god this religion was never supposed to remember. It is one of the earliest surviving images to give the devil a face at all, and the face he gets isn't invented from nothing. What strikes me most is that it's assembled, the same way his name and his biography were assembled, out of parts nobody bothered to credit. Here's what I find striking about how late this actually happens. Everything traced so far in this series, the courtroom prosecutor of Job, the warring generals of Qumran, the fallen king repurposed from Isaiah, comes from written text. None of it comes with a physical description. The Bible never once tells you what Satan looks like. For roughly 900 years after the crucifixion, Christian art mostly avoided depicting him at all. and when it did, he was as likely to appear as a plain human figure or a shadow as anything monstrous. The horns, the hooves, the tail, the image that would eventually outlast almost every theological argument this series has covered, doesn't show up in the historical record until artists needed something concrete to paint and reached for the nearest available villain already lying around in the culture they had just converted. Scholars generally agree that this composite creature drew on several older gods at once. Pan, the Greek god of wild places, with his goat legs and horns. Poseidon, sometimes shown with a trident that later art quietly reshapes into a pitchfork. And Bes, an Egyptian household god with a lion's mane and a protruding tongue, invoked for centuries to frighten off evil rather than to embody it. Not every detail traces cleanly to a single source, and not every historian agrees on the timeline. The historian Ronald Hutton, who has studied the visual history of paganism in depth, argues that while composite monster figures appear in medieval art by the 9th century, the specific, confident identification of the devil's look with Pan, in particular, is really a much later phenomenon, gaining its clearest form only in the 19th century, as Romantic writers and early folklorists went looking for a pagan god sympathetic enough to reclaim from the very tradition that had once demonized him. The devil's face, in other words, may have been assembled twice, once roughly, in the medieval period, borrowing whatever frightening features were culturally available, and once more precisely, centuries later, by people trying to rehabilitate the very god they were borrowing from in the first place. Notice what's missing from this entire visual tradition. Any input at all from the texts this series has spent 3 parts examining. Ha-Satan never described his own appearance. Belial, Mastema, and Samyaza left no physical description behind either. Lucifer, cast down from Isaiah's borrowed poetry, arrives in Christian theology as a pure idea, a fall and a name, nothing more. The face belongs to none of them. It belongs to the artists who came centuries later and needed a villain their audience could recognize on sight, borrowed wholesale from the gods that villain was supposedly there to replace. A separate tradition, unfolding in a different language entirely, solved the same problem of a physical rival to God through the Quran. Here, the figure is called Iblis, and his story opens with a single act of defiance rather than centuries of borrowed poetry. When God creates Adam from clay and commands the angels to bow before him, every one of them complies, except Iblis, who refuses, arguing that he was made from fire and is therefore superior to a creature made from mere earth. For that single refusal, Iblis is cast out, but he asks for and receives a reprieve, permitted to tempt humanity until the day of judgment before facing final punishment. His very name carries the shape of that outcome inside it. Arabic tradition connects Iblis to the root balasa, to despair, a name that describes not what he did, but what refusing God's mercy cost him. Here's what I find striking about how honest the Quran is willing to be about the limits of his power. In one striking passage, Iblis himself is imagined addressing the very people he tempted on the day of judgment, admitting plainly, "I had no authority over you except that I called you, and you responded to me." Even at the height of his role as tempter, the text refuses to let him claim more credit or more power than the plain mechanics of an invitation freely accepted. The blame, in the Quran's own telling, never fully transfers away from the person who said yes. The way I read this, Iblis inherits a problem this series has already seen twice. Muslim scholars themselves have never fully agreed on what Iblis actually is. The Quran's own wording, describing him as one of the jinn, a class of beings made from smokeless fire with free will, satisfies most commentators that his nature is settled. But other exegetes, including respected names within the tradition's own commentary literature, have read the same passage as describing his origin rather than his category. arguing Iblis was in fact an angel elevated to guard paradise before his fall reduced him to something else. Both readings claim the same verse. Neither has fully retired the other. The same unresolved argument that once separated Belial from Mastema, still surfacing in a different century, in a different sacred language, over a different figure entirely. Look at the pattern holding all of this together one more time from the very top. The question worth sitting with, after 3 religions and 4 parts, isn't which version got the details right. None of this is presented to undermine Islamic teaching. Muslim scholars across 1,000 years of commentary, including some of the most respected names in the tradition, have argued this exact question of jinn versus angel among themselves, in good faith, without resolving it. Faith asks what Iblis's defiance means for human free will and obedience. History asks how the story of a fire-born being who refuses a command took the specific shape it did, and why later readers disagree about his exact nature. Both can be asked side by side without one canceling the other out. What this tells us across every part of this series is that a single, quiet pattern outlasted every name, every language, and every century this figure passed through. Hasatan began as a job, not a biography. A prosecutor working the day shift in God's own courtroom, bound entirely by permission he never exceeded. Every version that came after him inherited that same shape before it inherited anything else. Belial ruled a jurisdiction God assigned him. Mastema bargained for his portion of loose spirits and received exactly what he asked for. Lucifer's fall, however dramatic on the page, still required a rebellion against a throne he never controlled. Iblis's single act of defiance still ends with God granting the reprieve he requests. Every telling insists this figure is dangerous. Not one of them, across 3 religions and 2,500 years, ever quite lets him operate outside the boundary of a permission slip someone higher up was willing to sign. You might think a 2,000-year pattern like this has nothing left to say about the present. But every system that claims final moral authority still needs exactly this kind of figure somewhere in its architecture. Dangerous enough to make the stakes feel real, and contained enough that the authority above him never actually has to share the throne. We've seen this before, in the courtroom of Job, and in the war camp of Qumran, and in the fire that made Iblis before it condemned him. The same arrangement, wearing a different costume each time. That arrangement did not end when the last of these texts was written. It just stopped needing a new name. That, more than any horn or hoof or fall from heaven, might be the real story hiding underneath this one. Every era gets the adversary its theology needs. An accuser fierce enough to make the danger feel real, and obedient enough that the God standing over him never actually has to share the throne. The job description Job first sketched out in a heavenly courtroom outlasted every costume anyone ever dressed it in afterward. The candle burns low. The questions don't. Until we meet again, stay curious.